It was the sort of coastal fog that creeps into the Moreau like an uninvited boarder and rearranges the furniture. The little town of Col d'Acham by the sea, which in sunlight pretended to be jaunty with its painted railings and toy pier, now drooped like an old governess in a damp shawl. Even the gulls appeared to have mislaid their voices and swung voicelessly above the church tower of Saint. Mildred's, whose clock, like most respectable parish clocks, considered accuracy a vulgar compromise and chimed the quarters when it remembered. Lord Peter Wimsey, whose idea of a holiday had been forcibly inoculated with reality by means of a telegram, stood peering through his pince-nez at the sloping facade of Greyfriars House. He looked in the fog like a lithe and slightly distracted stork, the faintest suggestion of amusement about the corners of his mouth. He carried an umbrella that, Bunter declared, would do no credit to a crossing sweeper, and a hat that made the local bank manager feel underdressed. "I suppose," said Wimsey, "that one ought not to contradict a widow, even with the truth. But if Mrs. Calder persists in speaking of the shadow behind the window, I shall be forced to remind her that shadows do not habitually stand in front of the source of light. It is an immodesty in a shadow. They are generally better bred." Detective Inspector Charles Parker, who had endured both the telegram and the train with philosophical reserve, made a noise which could pass in a gentleman for a cough. The constable said he saw it too. He was on his rounds. Grey morning, lamps full on, curtains drawn everywhere else. In this room only the curtain was not fully across. He says there was a figure, he's quite sure, obscured by the blind. The house was supposed to be empty. At dawn, mister. Septimus Calder was found dead. "Quite," said Wimsey. "He died of heart failure because the current newspapers insist upon heart failure. The obituaries feel it more tasteful. It gives a man a civil exit." Parker let that pass. Greyfriars House, 18th century brick sulking behind 18th century laurel, presented 4 solemn windows to the street, 2 to each of the floors, and the kind of front door that looks as though it has made up its mind to outlive everybody. A constable with a naval moustache hovered importantly near the gate. The fog flattened his helmet into a halo and made him look almost ecclesiastical. "For the record," said Parker, consulting a note, "the time by Saint." Mildred's clock was 3 minutes to 1 when P.C. Yarrow observed the figure. At least, he thinks it was. He counted the 3/4 chime and then, after another stretch of his round, the hour. It would help if the clock kept decent time. "On the contrary," said Lord Peter, "it will help very much if it doesn't. A misbehaving clock is like a man with an alibi. One immediately wants to know where it was when it wasn't where it said it was. Ah, good morning. Bunter." "Yes, my lord." Mervyn Bunter, appearing with a camera case and the expression of a valet who tolerates all mismanagement in the universe, provided it is properly dusted, stepped from the fog with the economy of movement that made men en route to the scaffold envious. "Photographic plates," said Wimsey. "In triplicate, my lord. The damp will require vigilance." "I've always found damp to require a worn undergarment and a hot whiskey," said Lord Peter. "Shall we?" The scene unfolds. The door opened at Parker's ring, and a maid with eyes as red as the front door and hands scrubbed into obedience ushered them across a hall whose tile floor remembered cleaner seasons. The air had the faint, sweet smell peculiar to decaying flowers and shut parlors. Lilies, laurel, beeswax, and a trace of soot. "Mrs. Calder is in the parlor, sir," said the maid. "But the inspector, Inspector Latham, he said as he'd wait in the study till you come, sir, and ask you to go through direct." They went through and met Inspector Latham, a round, careful man with an air of leading an obedient frugality through life, like a wife who was not his first choice, but turned out capable. He saluted Parker, glanced at Wimsey with municipal resentment, and pointed to the thing in the chair. Septimus Calder sat forward at his desk like a man attempting a confidence. His head had fallen to one side with an air of listening. He wore a dark suit and a plain black tie, both the sort of garments that never commit themselves to an opinion, and his hair, excessively neat, had at the temple the first touch of white that flatters and informs. In front of him, the blotting pad showed a rusted arc where a paper knife had rested long enough to leave a stain, and beyond that, a candlestick. The candle had guttered down to a drunken spiral, like a snake that had lost heart. There was a little pool of wax at the base and, peculiarly, on the lacquered corner of the desk, the same wax again. 3 small domed beads, set neatly like the pips on a die. "I see," said Whimsy, "that Mr. Calder was either reading by candlelight from sentiment, or the electricity failed and the candle was a necessary humiliation. Since gentlemen of this generation commonly scorn sentiment as they do indigestion, I shall assume the latter. Where is the switch?" The switch was near the door, and the electrolia above, a modest triple affair, swayed when Whimsy blew softly upward at it, not so much from the breath as at the suggestion that life could be coaxed into it. "Dead since last evening," said Latham. "House fuse gone. The charwoman says Mr. Calder wouldn't have it mended till morning. Couldn't spare the man from the church, and she knows no other. He had a candle in the drawer." "Ah," said Whimsy, as though this explained the British Empire. "And the window?" The window that faced the street had its curtain drawn 2/3 across. Through the remaining third, the glass presented the fog as though it were something carefully iced. On the lower pane at the right-hand edge, there was the faintest smudge. A cloud no bigger than a thumbprint, hardly visible except to the maliciously observant. On the sill inside lay a small scatter of something granular. Bunter bent over it with the interest of a man to whom dust is a personal insult. "Sea salt, my lord, or a mixture, and soot." "Bless me," said Whimsy lightly. The old town in miniature. The locked room puzzle. Inspector Latham indicated the corpse with a stiffness that had been polished to efficiency. Dr. Ransom has examined and estimates death occurred between midnight and 2. Heart gave out. There is a family history. No signs of violence, no signs of a struggle, no reason to suppose anything but... He glanced at Parker, who deflected the glance toward Whimsy as if to say, "I have brought the person who refuses to suppose anything." "Anything but misadventure," concluded Latham. "Quite," said Whimsy. "Only if the constable saw a person behind the blind at 5-1, one would like to know who it was, since Mr. Calder is said to have supped with his sister at 7:30 and walked her home at 9, and since his niece swears she was abed by 10, and the unexpended electricity bills insist that nobody danced a polka on the light switch thereafter." "How do you know about the bills?" snapped Latham. "Because," said Lord Peter, "they always lie around like unpaid poets. One can hardly miss them. Prettily printed too. Bunter, a photograph of the window from exactly here, and then one of those beads of wax, the charming little triplets, so sweetly placed, and the candlestick." Bunter went to work, cranking the camera with gentle severity. Parker provided the timeline. The constable, Yarrow, knocked at the door when he saw the shadow. Got no answer. Walked on, came back at the hour. Night quiet, no sound. House looks asleep. He tells himself, that is proper, and goes on. At 7, charwoman finds door open, probably not properly latched. She finds Mr. Calder, like this. "And nobody thought to fetch the electrician," murmured Whimsy. "One ought always to fetch the electrician when confronted with the inexplicable. It is cheaper than the almighty." The desk held a neat array of writing materials, an inkwell like a squat toad, and, off to one side, a long ivory paper knife, clean of ink and wickedly sharp along one bevel. On the floor to the right of the chair, the carpet showed a dull drag mark, a shallow crescent as though somebody had drawn a bucket an inch or two and changed his mind. On the mantel shelf, between a pair of rather bad Staffordshire spaniels, lay a small square of polished wood, empty. Its purpose was obscure, but its vacancy had an air of offense. Whimsy smelled the air once more. Laurel, lilies, soot, and something else. What is it? Musk? Number? Beeswax, obviously. And a suggestion of what, my dear Parker? Brasso. Mr. Calder polished his own conscience. He went to the dead man with the diffidence of a man entering a pew. Calder's hands lay on the blotter, one open, one clenched. The clenched one had made a little crease in the paper under it that reminded Whimsy absurdly of childhood. How the knuckles make valleys when one is drawing soldiers, and the valley becomes the enemy trench. The open hand had a smear of ink at the rim of the nail, as if it had followed a line and fallen off. There was a faint discoloration at the lips, the kind that tells you nothing you want to know, and a bruise at the base of the left thumb that tells you nothing immediately and has the indecency to be definite. "Does the charwoman dust the paper knife?" inquired Lord Peter. "She says she does, sir," replied Latham. "And does she sharpen it?" "No, sir." "Pity," said Lord Peter without meaning it. He moved to the window and put his face near the pane, very close, so that his own breath fogged the glass. The smudge looked back at him with impenetrable stupidity. He touched the curtain cord. It came away in his fingers with a small, gritty sigh. The fringe at the end had been frayed. There were 2 knots in the cord, old and comfortable knots, and a third that was new and ugly. "Who draws the curtains?" said Whimsy. "The maid," said Latham. "At dusk, and Mr. Calder draws them again sometimes if she has left a chink." "How admirable to have a chink," said Whimsy. "Chinks admit more truth than windows. Tell me, did Mr. Calder believe in anything?" "Sir," said Latham. "Spirits, spooks, political promises." The inspector compressed his lips. He was churchwarden at St. Mildred's for 20 years and chairman of the Fishermen's Provident Fund. He took an interest in the restoration of the North Transept and in collecting, well, bits of glass from ruined places. Very pious in that way. Frugal. "Fragments of painted glass," said Whimsy with the faintest of interest. "The kind one fishes out of odd corners," and he kept a candle. "Bunter, do you see the drip there, the stagger?" Our candle made an excursion beyond its station. The wick has that little hair-curled look of a person who has been somewhere and come back without telling. Bunter, who had no patience with wax behaving out of turn, eyed it dourly. "I do, my lord." Parker's pencil made a small predatory movement over his notebook. "There's the matter of the niece," he said. "Miss Mary Calder lives here. The sister, Mrs. Rivers, was staying only 2 nights. They say Mr. Calder had been, well, not himself, since Michaelmas. Absent, preoccupied. There's also a Mr. Lionel Strang, some sort of antiquarian acquaintance. He and Mr. Calder had words in the street last week. And Mr. Calder had a letter from London 2 days ago which upset him. We haven't yet found it." Whimsy's eyes went to the grate where a brittle curl of newspaper remained, charred to translucency and holding together out of pure perversity. The printed fragment clung to a single word, Benef --. "No letter," he observed, "is ever content to make a quiet exit. It must always leave a little piece of its petticoat in the door. Did Mr. Calder habitually lock up?" "The writing desk is locked," said Latham. "The drawers, some are locked, some not. Nothing appears disturbed. And the door to this room?" "On the latch when the charwoman came. No key on the inside. Windows, fastened, and yet a figure behind them at 5 minutes to 1. Whimsy cocked his head, the faint clang from St. Mildred's made itself heard through the fog, reluctant and nasal. "The lying clock," Parker said. "We ought to see the sister." "Yes," said Whimsy. "And the clock." "The clock. The one that thinks it's Saint." "Mildred's cousin," said Lord Peter. The long case in the hall, if there is one, and if there isn't. The one in the kitchen, and if there isn't there, the one in the parlor that somebody promised to have mended after Christmas. If we are lucky, one of them will be wrong in an interesting way. They went out into the hall where a tall, melancholy clock, like a curate after a long sermon, looked down its nose at the umbrella stand. Its hands said 9 minutes past 10, which was a lie large enough to be artless, and its pendulum swung with the conscientious futility of men who have decided to forgive. On the wall opposite hung a little barometer which had given up. "Ha!" said Lord Peter, and put a long finger upon the clock's dial at the figure of 8. The ring of polished brass around the keyhole bore a faint crescent of discoloration, as though of frequent fingering. Somebody has been setting you right, and you have been setting somebody wrong. It is the only honest relationship in life. Mrs. Rivers proved to be a woman with grey hair that had lost its mind, and a jaw that would have fought for Dunkirk. She had an air of being unusually tidy in grief, as though she had tidied grief itself and put it in a drawer. Miss Mary Calder, on the other hand, made no show of composure, but cried in the wet, incompatible manner of very young women who are surprised to find that things happen to them. Whimsy's sympathy, never orthodox, but frequently true, played for a moment over both faces and withdrew delicately. He observed instead the curtains, chintz sprigged, the carpet, Axminster, the pattern reversing at the hearth where a roll had been laid, the bell-pull, cord shiny where hands had seized it for years, and the tray with tea that had gone cold with honest speed. "When did you last see your brother?" Parker asked Mrs. Rivers. "At 9. He brought me home from Mrs. Terence. He would not come in. He said he had odds and ends to do. He kissed me at the door. It is silly to say, but it was not like him, not—" She hesitated, angry with herself, not in his manner. "I cannot describe it." "And you, Miss Calder?" Parker softened his voice. "I said good night at 10:30, said the girl steadily, the tears retreating in the face of formality. "He was in the study. He was looking at the candle. I said the fuse was out and I would fetch Mr. Weems in the morning, and he said, 'No, child, let the dark be. We have been lighting too much lately.' I thought it was a joke." Whimsy turned his head slightly. "A joke is what a man says when he has just met the truth and hopes not to introduce them." "Lord Peter," said Parker warningly. Whimsy smiled. When a man looks at a candle as though it were a person, he is in a mood. "Nothing, Mrs. Rivers, nothing. Pray forgive me. And pray tell me, had Mr. Calder the habit of reading in this room late?" "In the evenings," said Mrs. Rivers. "He writes letters to the bishop and the harbour board. He keeps his accounts. She folded her hands with a certain pride. "He never left a bill to flatter its own face." "Commendable," said Whimsy. "It improves the complexion. Did he let persons in by the front door after 10? "No." "At last, something firm?" "No." "Then by which door, when he did let them in?" Mrs. Rivers' mouth tightened. "He did not. But he might have if a fisherman came about the Provident Fund. That would be the side door." "The side door gives upon the lane," murmured Whimsy, half to himself, "and the lane gives upon the sea." He rose, and in rising contrived to be suddenly quite tall and quite absent. It is a trick he has. The fog pressed its pale face to the window and peered in like a child at a toffee shop. "Parker," said Lord Peter, "you will forgive me if I ask an impertinent question. What did the church clock strike at 1? Was it clear?" "I asked P.C. Yarrow," said Parker. "He says it was a poor sort of strike. 1 clear, 1 muffled. He says the bell has a fault." "Bells always have faults," said Whimsy. "They were made for human heirs." "Bunter, the photographs. Obtain what you can of the window smudge, and procure, if possible, that charred newspaper's remaining modesty from the grate. Inspector Latham, May I, at some later moment, talk with your constable? A man who has seen a shadow behind a window may be prevailed upon to distinguish between softness of outline and hardness, between a blind stirred by draught and a blind stirred by a hand, between a candle set near the pane and one set far. These are the trifles on which God and murderers depend. Mrs. Rivers's hands twisted once upon each other like a small machine trying to wind an unwilling spring. "You do not think—" she began, and stopped. The question would not name itself. "Think," said Lord Peter lightly. "I never think till dinner. It is bad for the digestion. At present I admire deeply the restraint of your clock." "Our clock?" said Mrs. Rivers blankly. "The one that refuses to be on time," said Lord Peter. "It is not modern." He bowed over her hand with something that would have been gallant if it had not been so evidently true kindness, and went out again into the hall, where the long case surveyed him with ecclesiastical disapproval. He stood a moment, looking at the front door. It had that proud, old-fashioned latch which has seen wars, and no policeman will ever love. The inside bolts were not shot. The brass chain was unhooked. He laid a finger lightly upon the latch. It lifted almost of its own accord. "Bunter," he said softly, "you are an artist in trifles. Notice that there is soot upon the inside rim of the latch. Not much, a smear, and sea salt upon the inner sill. Somebody opened to the fog. Somebody invited it in. Somebody last night entertained the elements." "Very good, my lord," said Bunter. "And yet," said Lord Peter, "the gentleman who entertained did not trouble to tidy away his guest's calling card. That argues confidence or abrupt removal. I would dearly like to know which." From the church tower. Saint. Mildred's mangled the half-hour as if it were chewing a stale bun. In the street, beyond the gate, a figure moved momentarily as a dark smudge in the fog, and vanished again. A shadow behind the window is an ill-bred thing. A shadow in the fog is merely practical. "Parker," said Lord Peter, "congratulate me. We have a study with a candle that misbehaves, a clock that lies, a bell that stammers, a door that admits the ocean, and a dead man who dined austerely upon wax. It is a feast of good things. I propose to begin with the salt." And with that preposterous remark, which gave Inspector Latham a persistent sense of indigestion for the rest of the morning, Lord Peter went back into the study and, with the elegance of a man removing a glove, picked up one of the little beads of wax from the corner of the desk, held it to his nose and smiled very slightly, as though the wax had told him a joke at the expense of the whole county of Norfolk. The fog swirled past the windows, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the promise of secrets yet to be unraveled. In the locked study of Greyfriars House, surrounded by the detritus of a life cut short, Lord Peter Wimsey began the delicate work of separating truth from shadow, a task that would prove far more complex than even he, in his considerable experience with the criminal mind, could yet imagine. The little bead of wax yielded its secret with the reluctance of a witness under cross-examination. Wimsey rolled it between his fingers, and his eyebrows performed a small private dance of recognition. "Bunter," he said quietly, "this wax has been somewhere warmer than a study in November. It has the consistency of something that has traveled, and it smells, faintly but distinctly, of incense. Church incense, to be precise, not the commercial variety that flatters its ancestry with a phrase. Indeed, my lord, or something pretending to be church incense. There is a difference, rather, like the difference between grief and the performance of grief." He placed the bead carefully in his waistcoat pocket. "But first, let us consult the domestic oracle. The staff often possess a clarity of vision unclouded by sentiment or the unfortunate habit of drawing logical conclusions where none exist. The kitchen revelations. The kitchen proved to be a cavernous, high-ceilinged room that smelled faintly of coal dust, boiled cabbage, and the peculiar disinfectant that only charwomen trust. Mrs. Plum, for such was the charwoman's name, sat hunched at a scrubbed pine table, her face a road map of honest toil, and her hands perpetually chapped by industriousness. Her distress was evident in the way she kept wringing her apron, though her eyes, when she raised them, held a shrewdness that belied her tear-stained cheeks. "It's a terrible thing, sirs," she began, her voice a reedy lament. "Poor Mr. Calder, a good man, always paid on the dot, never a cross word, not really, though he had his ways, like we all do." "And what ways were those, Mrs. Plum?" Whimsy asked, settling himself on a rather hard-looking kitchen chair, which groaned under his weight with the resignation of furniture that has outlived its optimism. "Oh, nothing much, sir. Just particular. He liked things just so, his papers all neat on his desk. And the windows, he was very particular about the windows. Always wanted them shut tight, never a draught. Said the sea air was bad for the books. And the curtains, sir, always drawn full at night and pulled back proper in the morning. Except in his study, that is. He'd often leave the study curtains just so, a little bit open if he was working late. Said it helped him think, seeing the dark." Mrs. Plum sniffed, dabbing at her eyes with a corner of her apron. "But yesterday morning, when I came in, they were pulled all the way across. And then, well, the door was on the latch, which wasn't like him. He always double-locked." "Never. Not Mr. Calder." Parker leaned forward with interest. "You found the door merely on the latch? Not locked at all?" "No, sir. Just pushed to. I thought perhaps he'd forgotten, or maybe the wind had blown it open a bit. But it wasn't usual, and the mat was wet, soppy as if a child had paddled over it. I shook it well, but there was muck, black on the latch too. People as walks about in the night puts muck in other folks' houses." Whimsy's attention had been caught by a small, brightly polished silver salver on a side table, oddly formal for the working kitchen. "And this, Mrs. Plum? A rather smart piece for the kitchen, is it not?" "Oh, that, sir. That's Mr. Calder's. He brought it down yesterday morning. Said he needed it for something, but then he left it here. I meant to put it back in the dining room, but with all the fuss, well, I forgot." "He brought it down himself, just after breakfast, you say?" "Yes, sir. Said he needed it for some bits and bobs. Didn't say what, just put it there and went off to his study." The fuse box, confession. As they moved toward the scullery, Whimsy paused at the fuse box that sulked on the wall like a guilty conscience. Inspector Latham, with the air of a man about to be betrayed by wire, opened it. 3 carriers showed their lengths of thin fuse wire, tumbled slightly where impatient fingers had rethreaded them in the dark. The 4th, the lighting circuit, had no wire at all. The screws were slack, and the porcelain smudged with a thumb's grayness. "Note, Parker," Whimsy murmured. "The wire is not blown, it is absent. The Great British Let It Be conceals a small British action. Somebody unscrewed these and took out the wire. That requires a fingernail and intent. Our man did not leave it to Mr. Weems. He commandeered his own darkness." Returning to the study, Whimsy selected a thin key from the bunch and opened the right-hand drawer of the desk. There was a space where a candle had been, a smear of wax on the wood, and, tucked under a packet of string, a small iron implement. He lifted it out on Bunter's proffered handkerchief. A tiny fuse wire bobbin with no wire and, prettily coiled beside it, 3 inches of fresh wire with its end melted into a little glass bead. "Ah," said Whimsy softly, "our darkness was tested before it was made, and our man knows his fuses." The Lane investigation. "I should like," said Whimsy, "to examine the approach routes to this house. There is something about footsteps that stop and do not start again that I find philosophically unsatisfying. The lane behind Greyfriars proved to be a narrow passage between high garden walls, paved with cobbles that had been polished by generations of sea mist into a surface like black ice. The gate to the Calder property was equipped with hinges that announced themselves with the enthusiasm of a town crier. Whimsy lifted the latch experimentally, and the resulting shriek would have wakened the dead, had the dead been in a mood to be wakened. "So much for silent entry," murmured Parker. But Whimsy was examining the cobbles at the base of the gate with the intensity of a man reading his own obituary. "Bunter, the camera again, if you please. There, do you see? The stones are dry under the overhang of the gate, but elsewhere they are damp from the fog. Yet here, just here, there are 3 quite dry patches in a line, each about the size of a man's foot." "Someone stood here for some time," said Parker. "Someone stood here for some time after the fog had begun to settle, but before it had penetrated under the gate's small shelter. Someone who faced the house and remained quite still. Someone who was watching. From this vantage point, the study window was clearly visible, and with the curtain drawn as they had found it, it would have been possible to see the flicker of candlelight within. The constable's testimony. P.C. Yarrow proved to be a man of 40-odd years, with a kind of mustache that suggested nautical experience and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be neither surprised nor particularly impressed by it. "The shadow, sir," he said, "was definite. Not a trick of the light. Not a curtain blowing. A person, standing back from the window but visible through the gap in the curtain. Stood still for perhaps 30 seconds, then moved away from the window, deeper into the room, like... And you are certain of the time?" Yarrow's face took on the expression of a man defending his professional competence. "I heard the 3/4 chime clear as anything, sir. St. Mildred's may be slow, but she's regular slow. Then I walked from the church corner to Harbour Street and back. That's my usual round. And when I came past Greyfriars again, the hour was striking." "Did you notice anything else? Any sounds? Any other movement?" "There was someone about earlier, sir. Around 11:30. I heard footsteps in the lane. Slow footsteps, like someone who knew where they were going but wasn't in any hurry to get there. They stopped somewhere near the back of Greyfriars. I didn't hear them start up again. The church connection, their visit to Saint." Mildred's confirmed Whimsy's suspicions about the candle. In the sacristy, where the air smelt of damp vestments and sanctity, he examined the remaining church candles. "Bunter would approve," he said, holding one to his nose. "This is our study wax, Parker. I will not pretend we can trace a candle by scent, but I should be much surprised if Mr. Calder's candle did not begin life here." The Reverend Mr. Tarrant, whose hands were full of papers and whose smile attempted charity, wit, and apology, and succeeded in none, fluttered with distress. "Oh, but why? If he wanted a candle, he had only to ask. He was churchwarden. He had a key. Mr. Weems, the verger, proved more illuminating. We've 2 whole and some bits," he said when asked about missing candles. "Mr. Calder, he might take without telling me, only he'd tell me after. He did once at Michaelmas, and I says, Mr. Calder, candles is for prayin'. And he says, so was I. He says, prayin' for Mr. Strang to go away. Mr. Strang." Parker's pencil made a predatory movement over his notebook. "I seen him last night, though," said Mr. Weems with relish. "At about 10:30, coming out of the Angel puffin' smoke like a tug. He went up toward High Street. He went past Greyfriars. Only you couldn't see it, and I couldn't see him, so I won't say I seen him there." The emerging pattern, as they prepared to leave St. Mildred's, Whimsy paused in the nave, his pince-nez catching what little light filtered through the fog-dulled windows. "Consider, Parker," he said quietly, "what we have assembled. A man who deliberately darkens his house by removing fuse wire, who places a church candle by his window to create a visible signal, who leaves his front door on the latch. Most hospitable for a man. who habitually double-locked, who is observed by a watcher in the lane and by a constable in the street, both at crucial times, and who dies, apparently of heart failure, while conducting what appears to be a carefully orchestrated performance. Performance? The question, said Whimsy, is whether he was the director or merely the principal actor, and whether the performance concluded as planned or whether someone decided to write their own ending. The fog continued its reluctant retreat, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the half-hour with crisp precision. Time, it seemed, was reasserting itself over Coldasham by the sea, bringing with it the uncomfortable clarity that murders, unlike mysteries, must eventually submit to the tyranny of facts. "Come," said Lord Peter, adjusting his disreputable umbrella. "We must pay our respects to Mr. Strang and his disputed glass. I have a feeling that the true nature of Mr. Calder's saint, Felix, may prove rather more illuminating than its previous owner intended." As they walked through the clearing fog toward the high street, the pieces of the puzzle began to arrange themselves in Whimsy's mind with the precision of a well-regulated clock, though whether they would ultimately reveal the time of death or the hour of deception remained to be seen. Mr. Lionel Strang's establishment occupied a narrow frontage between a fishmonger whose optimism exceeded his custom and a milliner who had given up hope sometime during the previous reign. The sign above the door read, "Antiquities and Ecclesiastical Curiosities," in letters that had once been gold and were now the color of old brass, which seemed appropriate for a man who made his living from the dignified decay of better times. The shop bell announced their arrival with the enthusiasm of a sexton calling the faithful to matins, and from the depths of the establishment emerged Mr. Strang himself, a spare man of perhaps 50 years, with the kind of beard that suggests its owner has made peace with solitude in the pale, intense eyes of one who spends his days peering at objects that have outlived their makers. The dealer's domain. The shop interior breathed the particular atmosphere of accumulated centuries. Dust motes dancing in shafts of watery light, the sweet mustiness of old wood and older paper, and beneath it all, the faint metallic tang of tarnished silver and ancient bronze. Every surface bore its burden of history. Fragments of carved stone, tarnished chalices, illuminated manuscripts in various states of dignified collapse, and, catching what light there was, scattered pieces of stained glass that threw small rainbows across the cluttered shelves. "Inspector Parker," said Strang, his voice carrying the careful modulation of a man accustomed to explaining the value of things to those who might not immediately perceive it. His gaze shifted to Whimsy with the wariness of a scholar confronting a potential Philistine. "And you, sir, would be Lord Peter Whimsy. Your reputation in certain circles precedes you, though I confess I had hoped our paths might never cross in a professional capacity." "Purely amateur interest, I assure you," said Whimsy, his attention already wandering to a small bracket clock on a nearby shelf whose hands declared it to be 20 minutes ahead of the time saint. Mildred's had grudgingly admitted to, "Though I find that death, like antiquity, has a way of making professionals of us all." The Quarrel, Reconstructed. Parker consulted his notebook with the methodical precision of a man building a case from fragments. "Mr. Strang, we understand you had some disagreement with Mr. Calder recently. A public altercation, according to witnesses." Strang's hands, Whimsy observed, bore the particular stains of his trade. Ink, metal polish, and something darker that might have been the patina of centuries. Those hands now clenched slightly as he replied, "Disagreement is a pallid word for what occurred between Septimus Calder and myself. The man was a collector without conscience, inspector, a magpie in churchwarden's clothing who confused acquisition with appreciation. He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small object wrapped in velvet. 'This,' he said, unwrapping it with the reverence of a priest handling a relic, "is a fragment of the saint. Felix' window from the ruins of Greyfriars Abbey. 14th century, of incalculable historical value. I had been negotiating its acquisition for the British Museum for the better part of 2 years when Calder swooped in with a private offer that was both legally questionable and morally reprehensible. The glass fragment caught the light and seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. A hand holding what might have been a key or a dagger, rendered in deep blues and crimsons that spoke of an age when color was both rare and sacred. The professional wound. I confronted him, Strang continued, his voice rising slightly. In the street, yes, where anyone might hear. I told him he was a thief of history, a desecrator of heritage. He replied that possession was 9/10 of the law and that museums were merely graveyards for beautiful things. We exchanged words that I will not repeat in present company, and I informed him that I would take the matter to the appropriate authorities. "And did you?" asked Parker. "I wrote certain letters," Strang admitted, "to the museum, to the church commissioners, to anyone who might have an interest in seeing justice done. Calder had made enemies of his greed, Inspector. I was merely the most vocal of them." Whimsy had drifted to the window, where he stood examining a small collection of metal implements. Pliers, fine brushes, and what appeared to be several lengths of wire. "You do restoration work, Mr. Sa?" Strang. "When necessary. Medieval glass requires delicate handling. The lead cames deteriorate. The paint flakes. One must sometimes rebuild in order to preserve." His eyes followed Whimsy's gaze to the workbench. "Those are the tools of conservation, Lord Peter. Some might call it forgery, but I prefer to think of it as resurrection." The alibi. Examined. "Where were you last evening, Mr. Strang?" Parker's question fell into the cluttered silence like a stone into still water. "At the Angel Public House until 10 o'clock, discussing a Roman coin with Mr. Henderson. You may verify this with him. I then walked directly home, arriving by 10:30, and retired to bed. I'm a man of regular habits, Inspector. Irregularity is the enemy of scholarship. You walked past Greyfriars House on your way home. It lies on the route, yes, though I paid it no attention. My mind was occupied with more elevated matters than Septimus Calder's architectural pretensions." Whimsy had been examining the bracket clock more closely. "A charming piece. Thomas Tompion, I believe. It seems to be running somewhat fast." Strang puffed himself up with professional pride. "A masterpiece of horological engineering. It keeps perfect time, naturally. I wind it every Sunday without fail." "Perfect time," mused Whimsy, "being a relative concept. Perfect by whose standard, one wonders? St. Mildred's, Greenwich, or merely perfect in its own consistent imperfection?" The physical evidence. As they prepared to leave, Bunter's voice interposed itself with characteristic discretion. "If I may, my lord." He had been examining the workbench with the intensity of a man for whom disorder was a personal affront. "These wire fragments, they appear to be of different compositions. Copper here, and what might be fuse wire there. And this small residue," he indicated a tiny pile of what looked like ash mixed with something granular. "It has the appearance of incense, though mixed with other substances." Strang's composure flickered momentarily. "I burn incense occasionally. It helps with the authentication process. Medieval glass was often exposed to church incense for centuries. The scent becomes part of the piece's history." "How wonderfully romantic," said Whimsy. "History preserved in the nostrils. Though one might wonder why you would need fuse wire for such atmospheric endeavors." "Every household keeps fuse wire," Strang replied, but his voice had taken on a defensive edge. "One never knows when the electricity might fail." The red herring revealed. Outside in the street, Parker consulted his notebook with satisfaction. "Well, that seems clear enough. Motive, opportunity, and an alibi that depends entirely on his own word. The police will be very interested in Mr. "Strang, the police," said Whimsy, adjusting his pince-nez against the watery afternoon light, "are often interested in the most obvious solutions. It saves them the tiresome business of looking beneath the surface. Now, Mr. Strang is indeed a man with motive and opportunity, but he is also a man who makes his living from careful observation and precise timing. Would such a man really walk past his victim's house on the very night he planned to commit murder? Would he leave such obvious evidence of his activities scattered about his workshop? Would he, in short, be quite so conveniently suspicious? He paused to examine one of the wax beads from his waistcoat pocket, holding it up to catch the light. "Consider also his clock, Parker. A man who prides himself on precision keeps a timepiece that runs 20 minutes fast. Either he is less precise than he claims, or he has reasons for wanting his time to be different from everyone else's. In either case, it makes his alibi rather more interesting than it first appeared." The deeper current. "No Parker, Mr. Strang is our red herring, beautifully prepared, perfectly seasoned with motive and opportunity, and served up with just enough suspicious behavior to satisfy the appetite for obvious solutions. But like all red herrings, he serves to distract us from the real current beneath the surface." They walked in silence for a moment, the fog having lifted enough to reveal the true architecture of Coldasham by the sea, a town built on the intersection of commerce and piety, where ancient stones supported modern ambitions, and where the line between preservation and exploitation was as thin as the lead cane that held stained glass together. "The question," Whimsy continued, "is not whether Mr. Strang had reason to kill Septimus Calder, but whether someone else had reason to make it appear that he did. And that, my dear Parker, is a considerably more interesting puzzle." The church clock struck the half-hour with its characteristic stammer, and somewhere in the distance another clock answered with perfect precision. Time, it seemed, was as relative in Coldasham by the sea as truth itself, and both were subject to the interpretations of those who claimed to understand their proper measurement. The trail continues. "Come," said Lord Peter, turning toward the solicitor's office that squatted like a respectable toad between the post office and the bank. "Let us see what Mr. Finch can tell us about the disposition of Mr. Calder's worldly goods. A man's will, Parker, is often more revealing than his diary, for it shows not what he thought he was, but what he hoped to be remembered as. And in the gap between those two things, murderers often find their opportunity." The afternoon light was beginning to fade, and with it the comfortable certainties of obvious solutions. In the gathering dusk, the true shape of the mystery began to emerge. Not the simple story of a quarrel between antiquarians, but something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. A tale of family secrets, hidden identities, and the terrible price of keeping up appearances in a town where everyone watched and everyone remembered, but no one spoke the truth until it was far too late. Mr. Finch's office possessed that particular atmosphere of accumulated respectability that comes from 3 generations of handling other people's secrets with discretion and charging handsomely for the privilege. The solicitor himself was a man whose every gesture suggested an intimate acquaintance with the more tedious aspects of human nature, tempered by the consoling knowledge that such tedium was generally profitable. His desk bore the sediment of careful practice, deed boxes labeled in a copper-plate hand that had outlived its author, ribbon-tied bundles of correspondence, and a brass inkwell that had witnessed more confessions than most priests. "Lord Peter, Inspector Parker," said Mr. Finch, rising with the measured dignity of a man whose joints had been negotiating with November for several decades. "A most distressing business. Mr. Calder was not merely a client, but a pillar of our small community. His family has entrusted their affairs to this firm since my grandfather's time. The will's revelations." Whimsy settled himself in the client's chair with the air of a man who had found the universe temporarily arranged to his satisfaction. "And what, Mr. Finch, did those affairs amount to? In the tangible sense. Naturally. The intangible affairs of the soul are presumably between Mr. Calder and his maker, though one suspects they may prove more illuminating to our inquiry than either party originally intended. Mr. Finch's fingers performed a small, nervous dance over the papers before him. Mr. Calder's estate is more substantial than his modest lifestyle might suggest. The house, naturally, has been in the family since his grandfather's time. But there are also investments, carefully managed, and his collection of ecclesiastical artifacts. The total value approaches £15,000. Parker's pencil made an interested movement. And the disposition. Mr. Finch removed his spectacles and polished them with the deliberation of a man buying time to choose his words. The will was altered quite recently, only 6 weeks ago, in fact. Under the new terms, Miss Mary Calder inherits the bulk of the estate, but with a significant condition. She must remain unmarried until she attains the age of 25. Should she marry before that time, the principal inheritance passes to Mrs. Rivers, with only a modest annuity remaining for Miss Calder herself. And Miss Calder's current age? Inquired Whimsy, his attention apparently caught by a small brass paperweight on the desk. A medieval knight in prayer, worn smooth by generations of anxious fingers. 23, my lord. She will reach 25 in March of the year after next. 16 months, murmured Whimsy. Hardly an eternity, but sufficient time for a young woman to encounter romance, or for romance to be encouraged to encounter her. One assumes there was some particular reason for this temporal precision. The complicating factors. Mr. Finch's discomfort became more pronounced. Mr. Calder had become aware of certain attachments that he felt were unsuitable. There have been visits from a young man, a Mr. James Pemberton, who claims to be researching ecclesiastical art. Mr. Calder suspected the young man's interests were not entirely academic. And the collection itself? Asked Parker. What becomes of that under the new will? The Saint. Felix fragment specifically is bequeathed to the Diocesan Museum at Norwich, to be delivered immediately upon Mr. Calder's death. The remainder of the collection stays with the house, passing to whichever lady inherits. However, Mr. Finch consulted another document. There was to be a codicil. Mr. Calder came to me yesterday morning with a draft, expressing his desire to make additional changes. He seemed particularly agitated about the timing. Whimsy's eyebrows performed their characteristic ballet of interest. Timing, in what sense? He was most insistent that any new provisions should take effect immediately upon his death, regardless of the hour. He asked several questions about the legal significance of dates, about whether a document signed after midnight might bear the date of the following day. When I explained the complexities involved, he laughed, rather oddly, and said something about waiting for Saint. Mildred to tell me when tomorrow begins. The missing elements. This codicil, said Parker. Was it executed? No. He took the draft with him, saying he would return this morning with witnesses. He never came. Mr. Finch paused, then added reluctantly, there is another matter. Mr. Calder's personal effects, his gold pocket watch, his father's watch, which he carried daily. It was not found with the body. Most unusual. He was exceedingly particular about that watch, wound it religiously every morning. Whimsy had moved to the window, where he stood examining the street with the abstracted air of a man reading an invisible text. A man who is particular about time, whose death may depend upon precise timing, and whose watch has vanished. How very tidy. Tell me, Mr. Finch, did Mr. Calder keep any family photographs in his study? An album, perhaps? Why, yes, a large leather-bound album containing photographs of his late sister, Eleanor, Miss Calder's mother. He was devoted to her memory. The album was always on the shelf by the fireplace. Mr. Finch's expression grew puzzled. "Has it not been found?" "It has not," said Whimsy quietly. "Which raises the question of why a man arranging his affairs so carefully would remove the one memento he treasured above all others. The family dynamics." They found Mrs. Rivers and Miss Mary in the drawing-room, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains with the pallor of November resignation. Mrs. Rivers maintained her composure with the determination of a woman who had survived worse things than death, while Mary sat by the window with the particular stillness of youth confronting the incomprehensible. "Miss Calder," said Whimsy gently, "I understand your uncle had been somewhat preoccupied in recent weeks. Did he speak of any particular concerns?" Mary's eyes, red-rimmed but alert, met his. "He was different after Michaelmas. Distant. He would spend hours in his study, sometimes just staring at the fire. He said he had made a mistake long ago and that he had to set things right before it was too late. I thought he meant the quarrel with Mr. Strang. Did he mention the changes to his will?" A faint color stained her cheeks. "He said I must be very careful about forming attachments, that young men often had motives beyond what they declared. He seemed to think—" She hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. "He seemed to think that someone might wish to marry me for mercenary reasons." Mrs. Rivers' knitting needles clicked with nervous precision. "Septimus was always protective of Mary. Perhaps overly so. He never married himself, you know. Said he could never find another woman to compare with Eleanor." The photographic evidence. Whimsy's attention was caught by a small framed photograph on the side table. A young woman with intelligent eyes and a cascade of dark hair, smiling with shy warmth. "Your mother, Miss Calder?" "Yes. Everyone says I resemble her." "Indeed you do." Whimsy studied the photograph with particular attention. "Mrs. Rivers, you mentioned that your brother kept an album of photographs of your sister. Might we examine it?" Mrs. Rivers looked puzzled. "It should be in his study, on the shelf by the fireplace." He looked at it often, especially in the evenings when he thought no one was watching. But when they searched the study, the album was nowhere to be found. The shelf by the fireplace showed a rectangular patch of less faded wood where something had rested for years, but the space was empty. The pattern emerges. "Curious," murmured Whimsy, running his finger along the empty space. "A man who treasures his sister's memory above all else, who keeps her photographs close at hand, who never married because no other woman could compare, and yet, in his final days, he removes the very album he cherished most. One might almost think he wished to hide something." He turned to face the room, his gaze taking in the empty space on the mantel where the saint. Felix Glass had been. The guttered candle with its telltale wax drippings, the window with its carefully arranged curtain gap. "Parker," he said quietly, "we have a man who changes his will to control his niece's future, who removes his most precious possessions, who creates an elaborate signal system with candles and curtains, and who dies at precisely the moment when time itself becomes crucial to his plans. Either Mr. Calder was orchestrating his own death with remarkable precision, or someone else was orchestrating it for him." The deepening mystery? As they prepared to leave Greyfriars House, the fog began to thicken, again blurring the boundaries between the visible and the hidden. Whimsy paused at the front door, his hand on the latch that had admitted the night air and possibly something more. The missing watch, Parker, and the missing album. The changed will and the unsigned codicil, the careful timing and the misbehaving clocks. Our Mr. Calder was either the most meticulous suicide in the annals of self-destruction or the victim of someone who understood his habits, his weaknesses, and his secrets with remarkable intimacy. The church clock struck the half-hour with its characteristic stammer, and somewhere in the distance another timepiece answered with different conviction. In Coldsham by the sea, it seemed, even time could not agree with itself. a circumstance that, in a case turning upon the precise moment of death and the legal significance of dates, promised to prove more significant than anyone yet realized. "Come," said Lord Peter, adjusting his disreputable umbrella against the gathering dusk. "Let us see what the Angel public house can tell us about Mr. Strang's movements last evening. I have a feeling that our red herring, while beautifully prepared, may prove to have been swimming in waters rather more complex than they first appeared." The fog closed around them as they walked toward the warm lights of the inn, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and the promise that before another night had passed, the carefully constructed edifice of lies and half-truths surrounding Septimus Calder's death would begin to crumble, revealing the uncomfortable reality that in small towns the most dangerous secrets are often those hidden within the family itself. The Angel public house exhaled the comfortable miasma of honest commerce, stale tobacco, spilled ale, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in places where men gather to discuss the failings of governments and the prospects of the local football 11. The saloon bar possessed that democratic shabbiness which makes earls and fishermen equally welcome, provided they can pay for their pint and keep their voices to a civilized roar. Mr. Henderson, the landlord, proved to be a man whose weathered features suggested long experience in the delicate art of listening to other people's business while appearing to mind his own. His establishment bore the accumulated patina of 3 decades behind the bar, and his memory for faces was exceeded only by his professional discretion regarding the contents of conversations he had never officially overheard. The alibi examined. "Mr. Strang, yes indeed," Henderson confirmed, polishing a pewter tankard with the automatic precision of long practice. "Regular as St. Paul's he is. Comes in most evenings about 9, takes his pint by the fire, sometimes brings his little antiquities to show the gentlemen. Last night he had a Roman coin, silver denarius, he called it, and was explaining to old Mr. Dobson about emperors and their peculiar habits of dying." Parker consulted his notebook with methodical precision, and he remained until 10 o'clock. 10 sharp, Inspector. I know because he always leaves when I call the first time. Doesn't care for the crowd that comes in after the omnibus from Norwich. Says they lack appreciation for the finer things. Henderson's expression suggested he found this pretension harmless enough, if mildly amusing. Whimsy had drifted to examine the long case clock that presided over the bar with the dignity of a parish beadle. Its brass face bore the particular gleam that comes from daily attention, and its pendulum swung with the steady conviction of honest timekeeping. "A handsome piece," he observed. "Keeps good time, I trust." "Better than the church, my lord. I set her by the wireless every morning. 9 o'clock news. Regular as clockwork. She's never more than a minute out, which is more than can be said for Saint. Mildred's. That old bell's been telling lies since before my grandfather's time." The temporal discrepancies. This detail struck Whimsy with the force of revelation. "So when Saint, Mildred's strikes 10, your clock shows 1/4 near enough, sometimes more. The church is a law unto herself, always has been. But my clock tells the truth, and Mr. Strang knows it. He goes by my chimes, not the church's." A fisherman at the bar, whose face bore the particular weathering that comes from arguing with the North Sea, leaned forward with the authority of one who had witnessed history in the making. "I was here when Mr. Strang left," he offered. "Tom Wickham's the name. Saw him go out calm as you please, discussing some emperor's nose on a bit of old metal. Nothing agitated about him." "And the time?" Whimsy inquired with casual interest. 10 by this clock here," Wickham replied, gesturing toward Henderson's timepiece, "which would make it about 5 to by the church, wouldn't it, Mr. Henderson? The muffled bell's secret." Henderson nodded confirmation. "Aye, that's about right. Though last night the church bell sounded queer, mournful-like. One clear strike, then a sort of muffled echo. gave me the shivers, it did. Whimsy's attention sharpened, like a blade finding its edge. Muffled, you say? In what manner? Like they do for funerals, Wickham explained. They put a leather pad on the clapper, makes it sound like two bells arguing with each other. One clear, one soft. Heard it clear when it struck the hour later on. And what hour was that? Parker asked. 1 o'clock, said Wickham firmly. I was walking home from my brother's place. Heard it plain. One clear note, then the muffled echo. Made me think of death walking, it did. Proper Gothic, like something out of them penny dreadfuls. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Parker that spoke volumes. A half-muffled bell would indeed create the impression of supernatural visitation to a superstitious observer, while providing a perfectly rational explanation for the stammering quality P.C. Yarrow had described. The timeline reconstructed. So, Whimsy mused aloud, we have Mr. Strang departing the Angel at 10 o'clock by an accurate timepiece, which corresponds to approximately 5 minutes to 10 by St. Mildred's unreliable chronometry. A brisk walk to Greyfriars would place him there by, shall we say, 10 minutes past 10 by the church clock, or quarter past by accurate time. But P.C. Yarrow saw the shadow at 3 minutes to 1 by the church, Parker added. Precisely. Which means our shadow appeared some 3 hours after Mr. Strang's documented departure from this establishment. Either our antiquarian friend possessed remarkable patience, or someone else was conducting business in that candlelit study. Henderson had been following this exchange with the absorbed interest of a man whose professional life depended upon understanding the complexities of human nature. There was another gentleman asking after Mr. Strang last night, he offered. Young fellow, Mr. Pemberton, lodges down at Mrs. Hartwell's. Came in about 10:15, seemed surprised to have missed him. The pursuing shadow. James Pemberton. Parker's pencil made a predatory movement across his notebook. The same. Pleasant young man, always polite. But he seemed, well, agitated isn't too strong a word. Asked which way Mr. Strang had gone, how long he'd been gone. When I told him toward High Street, he went off quick as you please in the same direction. Whimsy's eyebrows performed their characteristic dance of interest. How long after Mr. Strang's departure did Mr. Pemberton arrive? 10 minutes, perhaps 15. Long enough for Mr. Strang to have reached High Street, certainly. And long enough, Whimsy murmured, for a younger man with longer legs to overtake him, given sufficient motivation. Tell me, Mr. Henderson, in your considerable experience of human nature, when a young man pursues an older one through the streets at night, what manner of business typically motivates such urgency? Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. Depends on the young man, I suppose, and the business between them, but urgent business, certainly. The sort that won't wait for morning. The route tested. Outside the Angel, the fog had begun its evening retreat, leaving the cobblestones slick with moisture and the street lamps haloed in uncertain light. Whimsy paused to consult his pocket watch, a slim gold piece that had belonged to his father and maintained time with the precision of a guilty conscience. Come, Parker, let us test our chronology in the most practical manner possible. He set off toward High Street with the measured pace of a man who understood that truth often lay in the accumulation of small, verifiable facts. Mr. Strang departs the Angel at 10 by Henderson's accurate clock. Young Pemberton follows at 15:15. Both men heading toward High Street, which passes directly by Greyfriars' house. The walk took precisely 7 minutes at Whimsy's leisurely pace, during which time St. Mildred's clock chimed the half-hour with its characteristic stammer. So, Whimsy observed, by 10:30, church time, both our gentlemen would have passed Greyfriars. Yet someone was in that study 3 hours later, conducting business by candlelight. The lodger's secrets, They found James Pemberton in modest lodgings above Mrs. Hartwell's haberdashery in rooms that bore the particular shabbiness of a young man living on expectations rather than income. He was a pleasant-faced fellow of perhaps 26, with earnest eyes and the ink-stained fingers of one who worked extensively with old documents. His sitting room contained the usual detritus of scholarly endeavor, books, papers, and a small collection of glass fragments arranged on a makeshift workbench by the window. Mr. Pointer. "Pemberton," said Parker. "We understand you were seeking Mr. Pemberton." "Strang at the Angel last evening." The young man's color rose slightly. "Yes, Inspector. We had arranged to meet about a piece of medieval glass. I had some information about its provenance that I thought might interest him." "Information that could not wait until today?" Whimsy inquired with gentle persistence. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The truth is, I'd heard about the quarrel between Mr. Strang and Mr. Calder. I thought perhaps I might be able to mediate. The glass in question, it's genuinely important historically. It deserves proper preservation." Whimsy had been examining the workbench with the absorbed attention of a connoisseur. Among the glass fragments lay a small brass key, its surface bearing the particular patina that comes from frequent handling. "An interesting key, Mr. Pemberton. It has the look of something designed for a rather special lock." The family connection emerges. Pemberton's composure flickered momentarily. "It belonged to my mother. She died when I was quite young. I carry it for sentimental reasons." "How touching," said Whimsy. "And what did it originally unlock?" "A writing desk. My mother's writing desk. It was sold after she died, but I kept the key." The words came reluctantly, as though each one cost him something. "Your mother's name?" Whimsy's voice remained conversational, but Parker recognized the particular quality that meant his friend was closing in on something significant. "Eleanor," Pemberton replied quietly. "Eleanor Pemberton. A lovely name. And her maiden name?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before the young man answered. "Calder. Eleanor Calder, the hidden truth." The admission fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Parker's pencil stopped moving entirely, and even Bunter, standing silently by the door, seemed to straighten with increased attention. "Ah," said Whimsy softly. "So Miss Mary is not merely the object of your romantic interest, but your cousin. How very complicated." "One begins to understand, Mr. Calder's concern about unsuitable attachments." Pemberton's face had gone quite pale. "It's not what you think. Mary doesn't know, didn't know. Mr. Calder forbade me to tell her. He said the family had been through enough scandal, that some things were better left in the past." "Scandal?" Parker's professional instincts sharpened. "My mother was not married when I was born. The family disowned her. She took the name Pemberton and moved to London. Mr. Calder only found me last year through some legal inquiry about the estate. He said he wanted to make amends, but quietly, gradually. The orchestrated revelation." Whimsy moved to the window, where the gathering dusk had begun to blur the boundaries between certainty and speculation. "And yet you pursued a romantic attachment to your cousin without informing her of the relationship. Some might find that irregular." "I tried to tell her, but Mr. Calder insisted I wait until after his death, when the legal complications would be resolved. He was changing his will to acknowledge me, but it had to be done carefully to avoid questions about legitimacy." The pieces began to arrange themselves in Whimsy's mind with the precision of a well-regulated clock. The altered will, the missing photograph album, the carefully staged scene in the study, all pointing toward a man attempting to orchestrate a revelation from beyond the grave. "Tell me, Mr. Pemberton," he said quietly, "when you followed Mr. Strang last evening, did you find him?" "No. I saw him turn into the lane behind Greyfriars, but when I got there, He had vanished. I waited for a few minutes, then gave up and returned here. What time was this? About 10:30, I suppose. And you saw no one else? No lights in the house? The study window showed candlelight. I thought Mr. Calder was working late, as he often did. Pemberton's voice trailed off as he realized the implications of his words. The pattern complete. As they walked back through the darkening streets, Whimsy's mind worked with characteristic precision, sorting through the accumulated evidence like a scholar organizing a particularly complex manuscript. So, Parker, he said quietly, we have a man who discovers that his nephew, whom he had forbidden to court his niece, is actually his illegitimate nephew, making such a courtship not merely unsuitable, but impossible. A man who promises to acknowledge this relationship after his death, but only after, and who then dies under circumstances that ensure maximum visibility and mystery. The fog swirled around them, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and the promise of revelations yet to come. In the distance, St. Mildred's clock began its nightly argument with accuracy, its half-muffled voice speaking of death and deception with equal eloquence. No, Parker, said Lord Peter, adjusting his disreputable umbrella against the gathering darkness. I fear our Mr. Calder was not the victim of murder, but the architect of exposure. The question now is whether his carefully orchestrated revelation proceeded according to plan, or whether someone decided to write their own ending to his Gothic performance. The church bell chimed the hour with its characteristic stammer. One clear note, one muffled, like two voices arguing across the centuries about the proper time for truth to make its entrance upon the stage of human affairs. They found Mr. Weems in the vestry, polishing a pair of brass candlesticks with the solicitude of a man who believes tarnish to be an emblem of personal failure. He raised his head with the guilty quickness of a verger surprised with communion wine and recovered himself with dignity. Whimsy asked, in that conversational tone which compels truth by pretending not to notice it, whether saint. Mildred had been in the mood for funerals at 1:00 in the morning. Funerals, my lord. Lord love you, no. Not at 1. We muffles the bell for funerals, true, and for Good Friday. But I takes off the pads proper after, else you get the parishioners complaining, and rightly. Church oughtn't to go about sounding half sorry for itself at all hours. And yesterday, said Parker, any funerals yesterday? 1, sir. Mrs. Platt's aunt, 2:00 in the afternoon. I muffled the tenor bell for the service and took the pad off again at 3:30. I put it back in the vestry press. There, sir, top shelf under the linen. Would you like to see it? The missing muffle. The press yielded many articles of ecclesiastical modesty, and, beneath them, no leather muffle. Weems stared into the gap with affronted piety. Now that's odd, that is. Not odd at all, said Whimsy pleasantly. It has been to the belfry and back since you last saw it. Shall we inquire whether it came home? The stairs to the tower were the kind that inspire good intentions and, by the third turn, remorse. A spiral of stone worn into shallow scoops by centuries of parishioners climbing toward God and finding only rope. At the ringing chamber, the ropes hung like a set of commandments, the tenor thick and authoritative, the smaller bells neat and businesslike. The tenor's sally, its striped hand grip, bore on one side a faint smudge where something had rubbed, leaving a crescent like a dirty moon. Whimsy touched it lightly and then examined his finger with distaste. Soot and salt, he observed. Our old friends. And here. He bent to the floor where, under the bell frame, a leather pad lay indolently half-kicked beneath a beam. Home again, after a night excursion. Damp at the edges and stiffened with cold. I dare say, Mr. Weems, your muffle enjoyed the air as much as we do. Weems swore by Saint. Mildred that he had not replaced the muffle. I locks the tower after evening practice. There's only me as has the key. Well, and Mr. Tarrant and Mr. Calder had. He kept one for years, churchwarden's privilege like, but he'd no call to come up at night. Never did. The knot's tale. Virtue, said Whimsy thoughtfully, is admirable, but keys are more immediately useful. He knelt, not ostentatiously, and examined the knotted thong of the recovered muffle. Bunter, do you admire this knot? Ugly little brute. Resembles, to my indiscreet eye, the ugly new knot we admired upon the curtain cord in Mr. Calder's study. Bunter, who could recall knots with the same accuracy with which he recalled cufflinks, nodded. A reef knot attempted in haste, my lord, but brought off as a granny's knot. The ends lie foul. Precisely. Our ringer at 1 in the morning ties granny's knots in bell thongs and curtain cords without regard to decency. Mr. Weems, were the church doors locked last night? As always, my lord. I checks 'em at 9. Mr. Calder had a key to the south door, though. He'd come in sometimes for a sit-down. The tower gave back their silence with a faint whir of draughts, as though time itself were breathing. From the Louvres, one could see the pattern of Coldersham spread below. Roofs sloping toward the sea, lanes glistening, Greyfriars House presenting its sober brick face like a judge who has heard everything and is bored. The shadow experiment. Back at Greyfriars, the fog had thinned to a translucent veil. Whimsy requested the study to be left as it was and, with Bunter's efficient complicity, undertook a small private theatre. The curtain was set as the charwoman had found it, drawn 2/3, a chink left for a man to think by. The candlestick, with a fresh candle substituted for the disreputable martyr of last night, was placed upon the desk. Bunter was installed in the study and told to move the candle in response to lordly whim. Parker and P.C. Yarrow took up positions in the street. Now, called Whimsy from the pavement, place the candle in the middle of the desk. The blind glowed with a pale, diffused rectangle and showed no silhouette, but its own demure flatness. Bring it forward, 4 inches. A softened glow puffed at the curtain's edge, but still no human geometry. Lift it, arm's length, and go to the window. Bunter obliged. A figure sprang obediently into being, a dark head and shoulders, sharp as a woodcut, looming at the gap. "Hold," said Whimsy, and to Yarrow, "Is that your man?" "Yes, my lord, that's the look of it. Now walk away from the window slowly, as though going deeper into the room." The silhouette dissolved with surprising rapidity. 3 paces, and it was gone, though the curtain gap remained the same. The salver's secret. "The observation is worth the cold in the toes," remarked Whimsy. A constable saw a man, distinct, then gone. A trifling performance obtainable by moving the light rather than the man. Mrs. Plum's silver salver, so heedlessly stabled in the kitchen, makes an admirable bearer for a candle when one wants to paint on curtains. It also accounts for wax beads arriving at the edge of a desk where no candlestick ought to have been. He guided the edge of the salver to the lacquer, where 3 small domes of wax obligingly formed themselves. A man practicing with a candle would lay himself open to leave these little calling cards. Our dead friend, or someone, practiced. "But why the elaborate performance?" Parker asked. "That," said Whimsy, "requires us to examine what Mr. Calder was so desperately trying to communicate from beyond the grave. The London investigation. It was at this moment that a telegram arrived, brought by a boy whose bicycle had argued with the cobblestones and lost. Parker tore it open with the efficiency of a man accustomed to unwelcome news. "From the Metropolitan Police," he announced. "They've traced the inquiry agents who sent Mr. Calder that disturbing letter. Messieurs. Blackwood and Associates were reporting the results of an investigation Mr. Calder had commissioned into his sister Eleanor's death and the fate of her children." Whimsy's eyebrows performed their characteristic ballet of interest. "Children, plural. Eleanor died in London in 1901, But not of consumption, as the family believed. She died in childbirth, bearing a second child. The inquiry agents traced both children, James Pemberton, whom we know, and a daughter born 3 days later who was adopted by a family named Rivers. The implications settled upon the room like dust after an explosion. Mrs. Rivers was not merely Septimus Calder's sister-in-law, but the adoptive mother of his true niece. Mary Calder, believed to be the daughter of another sister entirely, was no blood relation to the Calder family at all. The album's revelation. The missing photograph album, Whimsy said quietly. Mr. Calder removed it because it contained evidence of this deception. Evidence he intended to reveal, but in his own time and manner. They found the album exactly where Whimsy expected, beneath the rolled carpet at the hearth, wrapped in brown paper with the kind of string that made Bunter's soul feel faint. The key from Mr. Calder's pocket watch chain opened it with ancient authority. The photographs told their story with pitiless clarity. Eleanor with her first child, James. Eleanor in the garden at Greyfriars, exhausted and lovely, holding an infant. And finally, a formal studio portrait of a young woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the child in the earlier photographs. The woman who had become Mrs. Rivers, adoptive mother to Eleanor's second daughter. The orchestrated truth. So, Whimsy said, closing the album with gentle finality, Mr. Calder discovered that his carefully constructed family legacy was built upon a foundation of lies. The niece he had protected and provided for was not his blood relation, while his true heir had been living in poverty, forbidden to acknowledge his birthright. He decided to orchestrate a revelation that would expose these truths dramatically. But the timing, Parker said. Why the elaborate staging with the bell and the candle? Because, said Whimsy, our Mr. Calder was not merely revealing family secrets. He was ensuring that his death would occur at precisely the right moment to make his revised will legally effective, while creating enough witnesses to establish the exact time. The muffled bell, the shadow at the window, the open door, all designed to create a memorable moment that would be talked about, remembered, and legally documented. The unscripted edition. He moved to the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The question that remains, Parker, is whether Mr. Calder's heart failed under the strain of his own theatrical production, or whether someone decided that his Gothic performance required a more permanent conclusion than he had originally scripted. The church clock struck the half-hour with its characteristic stammer, and somewhere in the distance, another timepiece answered with different conviction. In Col de Cham by the sea, even time could not agree with itself. A circumstance that, in a case turning upon the precise moment of death and the legal significance of inheritance, promised to prove more significant than anyone yet realized. Come, said Lord Peter, adjusting his disreputable umbrella against the gathering dusk. I believe it is time we had another conversation with Mrs. Rivers. There are questions about adoption papers and family histories that require answers, and I suspect that Lady's careful composure may prove less durable when confronted with documentary evidence of her own long-kept secrets. The fog began to thicken again as they walked toward High Street, blurring the boundaries between truth and deception, between the carefully maintained facades of respectability and the uncomfortable realities that lay beneath. In the gathering darkness, the true shape of the mystery was beginning to emerge, not merely the story of a man's elaborate death, but the tale of a family's carefully constructed lies finally coming home to roost. Mrs. Rivers received them in the morning room, where an aspidistra presided with the immovable virtue of a Victorian matron over a collection of china shepherdesses whose painted smiles had outlasted 3 reigns and showed no signs of fatigue. She sat with the composed dignity of a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of appearing unruffled by circumstances, though her hands betrayed her, moving restlessly among the tea things, straightening what was already straight, polishing what already gleamed. The photograph album lay upon the mahogany table between them like an accusation dressed in brown paper and tied with the kind of string that suggested secrets reluctantly surrendered. The unraveling begins. "Mrs. Rivers," said Whimsy gently, unwrapping the album with the ceremonial care of a priest unveiling a relic, "I believe you recognize this. Your late brother-in-law was most particular about preserving family memories. Perhaps too particular for his own peace of mind." She looked at the album without touching it, her face assuming the careful blankness that comes from years of practice. Septimus always was sentimental about Eleanor. It was one of his more trying characteristics. "Sentimental enough," said Parker, consulting his notebook with methodical precision, "to commission a private inquiry into the circumstances of her death. We have the report, Mrs. Rivers. We know about the children, both of them." The color drained from her face with the efficiency of water from a broken vessel. For a moment, she appeared to age 10 years, the careful composure cracking like old paint. Then, with visible effort, she reassembled herself into something resembling dignity. "The family secret." Exposed, Whimsy opened the album to the studio portrait of the young woman who would become Mrs. Rivers. A remarkable resemblance to Eleanor, even in youth. It must have been that resemblance that first attracted your husband's attention when he was seeking a wife and you were seeking a new identity. "You make it sound calculated," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "It was not. Harold Rivers was a good man who offered me respectability when I had none. I was Eleanor's friend. We had met at the lying-in hospital. When she died in childbirth, someone had to care for the children. Children, plural," Whimsy observed it with that particular gentleness that compelled truth. "James, who was sent to London, and the daughter, Mary, whom you raised as your own." Mrs. Rivers' hands twisted in her lap. "Eleanor was dying. The child needed a name and a home. My husband agreed to the deception. It seemed kinder. And when Septimus discovered us years later, he swore us all to secrecy. He said the family could not bear another scandal." At this moment, Mary herself appeared in the doorway, having returned from her errand to the post office. Her face, already pale from grief, went ashen as she took in the scene, the album, the adult's grave expressions, the weight of revelation hanging in the air like incense. "What is it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you discussing?" The painful truth. Whimsy rose with fluid grace, his manner combining authority with compassion. "Miss Mary, I fear we must discuss some rather complicated family history. Perhaps you should sit down." She remained standing, her chin lifting with a courage that reminded Whimsy powerfully of the photographs before them. "I would rather hear it standing, if you please." "Very well." He opened the album to Eleanor's photograph with the infant James. "This is your mother, Eleanor Calder. And this is your brother, James Pemberton." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. Mary stared at the photographs, her face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally a kind of horrified understanding. "It's not possible," she whispered. "James is... we are..." She could not finish the sentence. "Brother and sister," Whimsy confirmed gently. "Your uncle discovered this when James appeared last year. He was horrified to realize that you had formed a romantic attachment without knowing your true relationship. He felt he had to act to prevent what he saw as a catastrophe." Mrs. Rivers' confession. Mrs. Rivers found her voice thin and reedy but determined. "Septimus came to me yesterday evening after he had spoken to Mr. Finch about changing his will. He was beside himself. Said he had found a way to ensure the truth came out, but only after his death. He couldn't bear the thought of the scandal while he was alive." "And what was this plan?" Parker asked. "He said he would stage a performance to mark the exact moment of his death. He was going to remove the fuse wire to ensure darkness, light a church candle, and sit by the window where he could be seen. He would time everything to coincide with St. Mildred's striking 1 o'clock. He said the precise timing was crucial for the legal validity of his new will. Whimsy's eyebrows performed their characteristic dance of interest. A rather theatrical suicide, designed to reveal a complicated truth. And his pocket watch? The one that has gone missing? Mrs. Rivers hesitated, then admitted reluctantly, "He gave it to me for safekeeping yesterday evening. He said he didn't want it found on his person during the unpleasantness. He had sealed something inside it, a small paper explaining everything, to be opened after his death. The technical evidence." "Ah," said Whimsy softly. "That explains the wax residue we found in the watch case. But tell me, Mrs. Rivers, what do you know of bell muffling?" She looked genuinely puzzled. "Bell muffling?" "Nothing at all. Septimus said the bell would strike clearly at 1 o'clock. He was very particular about that. He said the whole plan depended on witnesses hearing the exact time. Yet someone muffled the tenor bell last night," Whimsy continued. "Someone who wanted to obscure the precise timing of Mr. Calder's death to make it seem less deliberate, perhaps even supernatural. Someone who climbed the church tower and replaced the leather muffle that Mr. Weems had put away after yesterday's funeral." Parker consulted his notebook. The constable heard the muffled strike at 1 o'clock, one clear note, then a softer echo. It gave him the impression of something otherworldly, the deeper mystery. "Which brings us," said Whimsy, his tone becoming more serious, "to a rather troubling question. Mrs. Rivers, you knew of your brother-in-law's plan. You had his watch in your possession, yet you claim to know nothing of the muffled bell. This suggests that someone else was involved in the events at Greyfriars last night. Someone who had their own reasons for altering Mr. Calder's carefully orchestrated performance." The implications of this statement settled upon the room like fog rolling in from the sea. Mary, who had been listening with growing horror to the revelations about her parentage, now looked up with a new kind of fear in her eyes. "Are you saying," she asked quietly, "that Uncle Septimus didn't simply die of heart failure, that someone interfered?" "I'm saying," Whimsy replied carefully, "that your uncle planned a very specific sequence of events designed to establish the precise moment of his death for legal purposes. The fact that someone altered that sequence, by muffling the bell, by rearranging the physical evidence, suggests either that his plan went awry or that someone else had their own agenda for the evening." The watch's journey. "The watch itself tells a story," Whimsy continued, producing the timepiece from his pocket, "found this morning by the churchyard wall, thrown there in haste. The sealed paper your uncle had placed inside was removed roughly, leaving traces of wax. Someone wanted very much to know what Mr. Calder had written, and was prepared to steal and destroy evidence to prevent its discovery." Mrs. Rivers stared at the watch with genuine bewilderment. "But I gave it to him yesterday evening as he requested. I never saw it again." "Then someone else took it from his person after death," Parker observed grimly. "Someone who knew about the hidden compartment and was determined to suppress whatever message it contained." Mary's realization. Mary, who had been following this exchange with growing comprehension, suddenly spoke up. "The study window," she said quietly. "When I said good night to Uncle Septimus, he was looking at the candle. He told me to let the dark be and said something about waiting for St. Mildred to tell him when tomorrow begins. He was planning to die at 1 o'clock, wasn't he? To make his new will take effect from the very first moment of the new day." "Precisely," Whimsy confirmed. "A clever legal maneuver, but someone prevented that plan from proceeding as intended. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting the timing obscured, the evidence altered, and the truth suppressed." The evening appointment. He rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who had found the next piece of a particularly complex puzzle. "I believe, ladies, that we shall need to have all the principals together this evening to sort out these various threads. Mrs. Rivers, I should like you and Miss Mary to join us at Greyfriars at 9 o'clock. Mr. Pemberton will be there as well. It is time he learned the full truth about his family connections." Mary looked at him with eyes that held both fear and determination. "And will you tell us who interfered with Uncle Septimus's plan?" "I believe," said Lord Peter, adjusting his disreputable umbrella, "against the gathering dusk, that the truth will emerge naturally when all the actors are assembled on the same stage. Your uncle was fond of theatrical gestures, Miss Mary. It seems only fitting that his final revelation should take place in the setting he had prepared for it." As they prepared to leave, the church clock struck the half-hour with its characteristic stammer, and somewhere in the distance, another timepiece answered with different conviction. In Coldasham by the sea, even time could not agree with itself, a circumstance that, in a case turning upon the precise moment of death and the legal significance of inheritance, had proved more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The fog began to thicken again as they walked through the narrow streets, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and the promise that before another night had passed, the carefully constructed edifice of lies and half-truths surrounding Septimus Calder's death would finally crumble, revealing the uncomfortable reality that in small towns, the most dangerous secrets are often those hidden within the family itself. The study at Greyfriars had been restored to its precise condition of the previous evening, every detail arranged with Bunter's characteristic attention to accuracy. The candle stood ready upon its silver salver, the curtain hung at its calculated 2/3 closure, and even the 3 small wax beads had been replaced at the desk's lacquered corner like evidence waiting to testify. At 9 o'clock precisely, they assembled with the reluctant dignity of players in a drama none had wished to join. Mrs. Rivers entered with her composure carefully rebuilt, but fragile as spun glass. Mary followed, bearing the particular pallor that comes from too many revelations compressed into too brief a time. James Pemberton arrived punctually, his scholarly diffidence now sharpened by the uncomfortable knowledge of his true identity. Mr. Finch attended with his legal papers, Inspector Latham with his professional skepticism, and P.C. Yarrow with the satisfaction of a man whose observations had proved significant. The stage prepared. Whimsy stood by the fireplace, his tall figure casting shadows that danced with the flame's movement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that particular authority that comes from complete understanding, "we are gathered to witness the conclusion of a performance that began last evening, a performance conceived by the late Mr. Calder, but significantly altered by someone whose script differed from his own." He moved to the desk where the evidence lay arranged, like actors awaiting their cues. Mr. Calder had discovered that his carefully ordered world was built upon deception. The young woman he had protected as his beloved niece was not his blood relation, while his true nephew had been living in obscurity, forbidden to acknowledge his birthright. More disturbing still, these 2 young people had formed a romantic attachment that, had Mr. Calder not intervened, would have proceeded to marriage between cousins, a situation he found intolerable. The original design. Faced with this crisis, Mr. Calder conceived an elaborate plan. He would stage his own death at precisely 1 o'clock in the morning, the first moment of the new day, ensuring that his revised will would take legal effect immediately. He practiced the staging with meticulous care. Whimsy lifted the silver salver. Mrs. Plum's salver, requisitioned from the kitchen, would hold the candle at precisely the right angle to cast his silhouette against the curtain gap. The removed fuse wire would ensure darkness. The church candle would provide the necessary illumination. The front door would be left unlatched for quick discovery. He lit the candle with ceremonial precision. But most crucially, the church bell would strike clearly at 1 o'clock, establishing the precise legal moment of his death before reliable witnesses. P.C. Yarrow on his rounds, anyone wakeful enough to hear Saint. Mildred's announcement of the hour. All would remember the exact time, making his death a matter of public record rather than private speculation. James Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. You mean he planned to kill himself? For the inheritance? For justice, as he saw it, Whimsy replied gently. His heart was already failing. Dr. Ransom had warned him his time was limited. Rather than leave his affairs to chance, he chose to orchestrate his departure with theatrical precision, ensuring his final wishes would be legally unassailable. The fatal interference. But someone interfered with his design. Whimsy's voice took on the relentless quality of a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence. Someone who realized that Mr. Calder's plan would expose family secrets better left buried, and who stood to lose everything if his new will took effect. He produced the leather muffle, holding it like an accusation. The church bell was muffled last night, not by Mr. Weems, who had properly stored this after yesterday's funeral, but by someone who needed to obscure the precise timing of Mr. Calder's death. Someone who climbed the church tower, secured the muffle with a hasty granny's knot, and created the stammering bell that P.C. Yarrow described. Mrs. Rivers had gone very still, her hands folded with rigid precision. The person who muffled the bell also entered this house after Mr. Calder had begun his final performance. They found him by the window, candle lit, waiting for 1 o'clock to strike, and they realized that a few minutes' difference in timing could change everything. The evidence assembled. Whimsy moved to demonstrate, positioning himself at the window with the candle. If Mr. Calder died at 1 o'clock precisely, his new will, acknowledging James as his heir and revealing the family secrets, would take effect with the new day. But if he died a few minutes earlier, still on the previous day, his old will would stand. The will that left everything to his beloved niece Mary, with Mrs. Rivers as her guardian and beneficiary. He set down the candle and picked up the recovered pocket watch. This watch was taken from Mr. Calder's body after death. The hidden compartment had been opened, its contents removed and destroyed. Someone desperately needed to suppress whatever final message he had prepared. Parker consulted his notebook. The soot and salt on the door latch matched the residue on the church bell rope. The granny's knot on the muffle matched the hasty knot on the curtain cord. Someone made multiple trips between this house and the church, working frantically to alter the evidence. The culprit revealed. Mrs. Rivers, Whimsy said quietly. You were church warden for many years. You had a key to the church tower. You knew about the bell muffle and where it was kept. Most importantly, you knew that Mr. Calder's theatrical suicide would trigger exactly the kind of investigation that would expose your long-held secret. Mary looked between them with growing horror. What secret? That you are not Septimus Calder's niece by blood, Whimsy explained gently. The private inquiry revealed that Eleanor Calder died in childbirth, but her son James survived. You, Miss Mary, are Mrs. Rivers' own daughter, raised with the Calder name and inheritance, but with no legal claim to either. The revelation fell into the room like a stone into still water. Mary stared at Mrs. Rivers, who had begun to weep silently. The confrontation. You visited Mr. Calder last night, Whimsy continued, his voice inexorable. You found him preparing for his 1 o'clock performance. You realized that his death, if properly timed and witnessed, would validate his new will and expose your deception, so you acted to prevent it. Mrs. Rivers looked up, her careful composure finally shattered. He was going to destroy everything, she whispered. After 30 years of giving Mary a good life, a respectable name, he was going to throw it all away for the sake of legal precision. So you muffled the bell to confuse the timing. You took his watch to destroy his final message. You may even have assisted his failing heart along its way. No, Mrs. Rivers' voice cracked. I never touched him. I simply told him the truth, that Mary was my daughter, not Eleanor's. The shock of it, learning that the child he had protected all these years was not his blood relation at all. His heart couldn't bear it. He collapsed immediately. The moral reckoning. Inspector Latham stepped forward with professional gravity. Mrs. Rivers, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. She nodded, her tears spent. I don't deny what I did. I muffled the bell, I took the watch, I tried to make his death seem less deliberate. I couldn't let Mary lose everything because of my deception. She's been loved and cherished as a Calder. That should count for something. Mary moved to her adoptive mother's side, taking her hand with quiet dignity. Whatever the law says, you are still my mother, the only mother I have ever known. James Pemberton, who had been silent throughout the revelations, finally spoke. I want nothing that would cause further pain. If Mary will have me, not as a cousin, but as myself, then perhaps we can find a way to honor Mr. Calder's memory without destroying what remains of this family. The resolution. Whimsy watched this exchange with the expression of a man who had solved a puzzle only to discover that human nature was more complex than any legal document. Mr. Finch, he said quietly, I believe there may be ways to arrange matters that honor both Mr. Calder's intentions and the realities of 30 years of family life. The law is sometimes capable of mercy when properly guided. As Inspector Latham led Mrs. Rivers away, she paused at the door. I regret the deception, she said with quiet dignity, but I do not regret giving my daughter a better life. That, at least, was real. The Gothic conclusion. When the house had emptied, Whimsy stood alone in the study, examining the 3 small wax beads that had started it all. Curious, Parker, he mused, how often the truth, like a persistent draft, finds its way through the smallest cracks in our carefully constructed facades. Mr. Calder intended to orchestrate a revelation from beyond the grave. He succeeded rather better than he knew. He extinguished the candle with a breath that seemed to carry away the last vestiges of the mystery. Come, our work here is done. The truth has been revealed. Justice will take its course, and the living must find their own accommodation with the complexities of love, inheritance, and family loyalty. The fog had lifted entirely as they walked through the narrow streets of Coldasham by the sea, revealing a star-strewn sky. Behind them, Greyfriars House settled into silence, its windows dark, its secrets finally exposed to the unforgiving light of the truth. In the distance, St. Mildred's clock struck the half-hour with perfect clarity. No longer stammering, no longer muffled, but speaking the time with the honest precision that had eluded it for one crucial night when the difference between truth and deception had been measured in minutes and the price of family secrets had finally come due. The morning brought with it that particular clarity which follows the lifting of both literal and metaphorical fog, when truth has finally emerged from the shadows and settled into its proper place among the verifiable facts. Lord Peter Whimsy found himself in the breakfast room of the Coldasham Arms, contemplating eggs that retained fond memories of their origins and bacon that spoke eloquently of pigs who had lived honest lives before their noble sacrifice to the cause of human sustenance. Parker arrived bearing the expression of a man who had spent the night wrestling with legal complexities and emerged victorious, though somewhat the worse for wear. Mrs. Rivers has made a full confession, he announced, settling himself with the careful movements of one whose joints had been negotiating with November's dampness. She admits to muffling the bell, stealing the watch, and attempting to obscure the timing of Calder's death. However, she maintains, and Dr. Ransom's examination supports, that she never physically harmed him. The medical and legal clarifications. Whimsy buttered his toast with the precision of a man who believed that small rituals provided necessary anchors in a world where truth proved more fluid than generally advertised. The shock of learning that Mary was not Eleanor's daughter, combined with his already weakened heart, proved sufficient to cause his collapse, he observed. A death by revelation, one might say. Rather fitting for a man who had devoted his final weeks to orchestrating revelations. The legal situation remains complex, Parker continued, consulting his notebook with the methodical attention of a scholar translating particularly obscure Latin. The timing of Calder's death becomes crucial. If he died before midnight, his old will stands. If after midnight, the new will takes effect. Mrs. Rivers' interference with the bell has created exactly the legal ambiguity she hoped to achieve, though perhaps not in the manner she intended. At this moment, their breakfast was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Lionel Strang, whose usually impeccable appearance showed signs of a night spent in moral inventory. His collar sat slightly askew, his beard bore evidence of nervous grooming, and his eyes held that particular brightness that comes from sleepless hours devoted to the examination of one's conscience. The final witness. "Lord Peter, Inspector Parker," he began without preamble, "I must speak with you. I have been less than entirely truthful about my movements on Tuesday evening." Whimsy gestured to an empty chair with the courtesy of a host welcoming an expected, if slightly tardy, guest. Truth, like good wine, improves with proper timing. What particular aspect of Tuesday evening requires clarification? When I left the Angel at 10 o'clock, I did not proceed directly home. I walked past Greyfriars and observed the candlelight in the study window. Given our recent quarrel, I thought this might present an opportunity for reconciliation. Strang's hands moved restlessly as he spoke, betraying the nervous energy of a man unburdening himself of a significant secret. I knocked quietly at the front door. Mr. Calder answered almost immediately. He seemed to be expecting someone. He was agitated, distracted, but when I mentioned the St. Felix glass, he invited me in. The study was arranged in what I can only describe as a tableau. The candle, the curtain positioning, even a silver salver on the desk. When I inquired about this arrangement, he laughed rather wildly and spoke of preparing for his final performance. The timeline reconstructed. Parker's pencil made its characteristic predatory movement across his notebook. And the time. Perhaps 10:15 by the church clock. Mr. Calder was clearly unwell. Poor color, trembling hands. He spoke of setting things right and showed me his pocket watch, claiming it contained the truth that would free them all. When I realized he was contemplating suicide, I attempted to dissuade him, but he became agitated and demanded I leave immediately. However, Strang continued, his voice gaining strength as the burden of secrecy lifted, I remained in the lane, genuinely concerned for his welfare. At approximately 11:30, I witnessed Mrs. Rivers approach the front door using her own key. She remained inside for perhaps 20 minutes, emerging in evident distress before walking quickly toward the church. Whimsy's eyebrows performed their characteristic dance of interest. "And you investigated further?" "I found the front door still unlocked. When I called out and received no answer, I entered the study and discovered Mr. Calder collapsed at his desk. He was already dead. The scene appeared staged somehow, artificial. I panicked, realizing my presence would appear highly suspicious given our quarrel. I extinguished the candle and left immediately. The resolution emerges. This testimony, Parker observed with satisfaction, places Mr. Calder's death between 11:30 and midnight, before Mrs. Rivers returned from her bell-muffling expedition. It suggests she found him already dead, and then created the elaborate performance with the shadow at the window to confuse the timing. Precisely, Whimsy agreed, his tone carrying that particular satisfaction that comes from seeing all pieces of a puzzle finally arrange themselves in their proper places. Mrs. Rivers's desperate attempt to obscure the timing may have achieved exactly the opposite of her intention. By creating confusion about whether Mr. Calder died before or after midnight, she has ensured that the courts will seek the most equitable distribution possible. The human resolution. The irony proved even more complete when they learned of the younger generation's response to these revelations. James Pemberton had formally renounced any claim to the Calder inheritance, declaring his wish for Mary to retain everything regardless of blood relationships. Mary, in turn, insisted on sharing the inheritance equally with James, establishing additionally a fund for Mrs. Rivers's legal defense. The younger generation, Whimsy observed with genuine admiration, shows a refreshing disregard for the legal niceties that so exercised their elders. They have achieved through generosity what the law might have struggled to accomplish through precedent. The philosophical conclusion. As they prepared to depart, Coldasham by the sea, Whimsy paused to examine the hotel's long-case clock, which kept time with the honest precision that had proved so elusive in other timepieces throughout this curious case. "You know, Parker," he mused, adjusting his disreputable umbrella against the clear morning air, "I find myself oddly satisfied with this resolution. Mr. Calder achieved his goal of revealing family secrets and ensuring justice for the next generation, even if the mechanism proved more Byzantine than he had designed. Mrs. Rivers' maternal instincts led her to interfere with his plan, but ultimately served to create exactly the kind of legal flexibility that allows for mercy alongside justice." The church clock struck the half-hour with perfect clarity, no longer muffled, no longer stammering, but speaking the time with the honest precision that had been its birthright. In the distance, the morning mist was lifting from the sea, revealing the true coastline in all its austere beauty. The final departure. "Come," said Lord Peter, stepping into the crystalline morning air where shadows fell precisely where geometry demanded they should fall. "Our work here is truly finished. The dead have had their theatrical say. The living have found their accommodation with truth, and time itself has resumed its proper function. The Gothic has been stripped away to reveal the human heart in all its complicated glory, which is, after all, the most satisfying resolution any mystery can offer." As their motor car pulled away from Coldasham by the sea, Whimsy reflected on the curious satisfaction of a case that had begun with supernatural suggestions and resolved itself into the most human of motivations: love, fear, and the desperate desire to protect those we cherish from the consequences of our own deceptions. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing a world where clocks told the truth they were designed to tell, where families could forgive each other's failures, and where justice, properly administered, could coexist with mercy. "After all, Bunter," he remarked to his faithful valet, "what is detection but the art of restoring proper time to a world where someone has attempted to make the clocks lie? And what is justice but the insistence that truth, however uncomfortable, should arrive punctually at its appointed hour?" The Norfolk countryside rolled past their windows, honest and unpretentious under the clear autumn sky, while behind them, Saint. Mildred's bell chimed the hour with newfound precision, marking time for a town where the shadows had finally learned to behave themselves and the mysteries had submitted, with appropriate reluctance, to the tyranny of facts. The familiar comfort of Piccadilly welcomed them with its accustomed mixture of soot and self-possession, and Lord Peter Whimsy, restored to his proper armchair with a civilized fire crackling at his elbow, submitted to the agreeable sensation of a world reassembled in its correct proportions. The mantelpiece clock, which maintained an honest relationship with Greenwich, chimed the half-hour with a precision that had proved so elusive in Norfolk's more temperamental timepieces. Bunter entered with the Morning Post arranged upon a silver salver with characteristic precision, his demeanor suggesting a man who had witnessed the satisfactory conclusion of yet another assault upon the natural order of things. Among the correspondence lay several items of particular interest to the recent proceedings at Coldasham by the Sea. Mr. Finch reported with lawyerly satisfaction that the coroner had returned a verdict of death by natural causes, accelerated by emotional shock. Mrs. Rivers, charged with tampering with evidence, had been bound over on her own recognizances, the magistrate having been moved by the testimony regarding her maternal devotion. The estate, he noted with barely concealed amazement, would be settled by consent. Mary and James, having agreed to a division so generous that the law itself seemed to capitulate out of gratitude for being spared the necessity of imposing Solomon's wisdom upon unwilling parties. A second letter, penned in the careful script of scholarly habit, arrived from Mr. Lionel Strang. He confessed to having been a pedant where he ought to have been a man, and reported that the saint Felix Fragment was already en route to Norwich, with proper provenance attached, including acknowledgment of Septimus Calder's faithful stewardship. As for his bracket clock, kept 20 minutes fast, it had been his superstition against tardiness, a vow he promised to abandon in favour of trusting time as made rather than time as desired. Parker arrived toward evening, bearing the comfortable scent of London pavements and the satisfaction of a case properly concluded. P.C. Yarrow's observational skills had earned him commendation. Mr. Weems had recovered both his muffle and his equanimity, and the Reverend Tarrant, having preached eloquently on truth and the bells that proclaim it, had found his collection plate mysteriously heavier. A final note, written in a hand that had learned courage overnight, came from Mary Rivers, for so she had chosen to style herself, without apology or explanation. She thanked them for preserving her from a greater deception than poverty, and mentioned that James had taken rooms near Norwich to assist the museum with its medieval glass collection. There was talk, she added, of establishing a fund for fishermen's widows to bear Mr. Calder's name, an oddly appropriate memorial for a man who had attempted to measure souls by the minute hand. If one were inclined to moralize, observed Whimsy, offering Parker a whisky that had been properly aged in the Scottish manner, one might note that clocks make admirable servants but deplorable masters. The readiness, as the bard reminds us, is all, but punctuality, like virtue, must be tempered with mercy. Outside, St. James's chimed the hour with crystalline clarity, and neither man felt compelled to verify its accuracy. They had learned, in the fog-wrapped streets of Coldasham, how truth finds its proper note after the briefest falter, and how, once found, it carries to the end with decent, punctual grace. The whiskey had achieved that golden equilibrium between the fire's warmth and the evening's chill, when Bunter appeared with that discreet cough, which served as his equivalent to a herald's trumpet. He advanced, bearing a flat parcel wrapped in tissue paper, which he laid upon the table with the reverent care of a curator handling a medieval manuscript. "If I might venture to trespass upon your lordship's attention," he said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who had solved a puzzle through methodical application of scientific principle, "this is the blotting sheet from Mr. Calder's desk. I retained it, judging it might contain impressions of value. The ink offsets were exceedingly faint, but by photographing through the paper and reversing the photographic plate, one can discern a considerable amount of text. The final evidence. Whimsy's eyes lit with the enthusiasm of a scholar discovering a previously unknown classical text. "Bunter, you are the Archimedes of stationary detection. Let us see what our departed friend wished to communicate to posterity." The photographs revealed ghostly letters, backward and fragmented, but Bunter's meticulous transcript rendered them clear as cathedral bells. Parker bent over the document, his professional instincts stirred to respectful admiration as he read aloud. "To be read if I'm found after the first stroke of saint. Mildred's at 1. Mary, Rivers, is dear to me as a child, but not Eleanor's daughter. James is Eleanor's son. I desire they share alike, and that no name be smirched. The glass to Norwich, the truth to be told to spare them worse. I have failed long, I will not fail at last. The final line, wavering as the hand had faltered, concluded with characteristic precision. Let the bell speak for me. So there it is, Parker observed with satisfaction. Chapter and verse. He meant equity, not vengeance. A man seeking to correct the mistakes of the past through careful orchestration of his final moments. The Gothic sensibility revealed and relied, like a proper Anglican, upon church bells to carry his doctrine to the inattentive, Whimsy murmured, settling back into his chair with the contemplative air of a man piecing together not merely facts, but the deeper currents of human character. You know, Parker, there's something that has continued to intrigue me about this affair. Calder's elaborate staging, the candle, the curtain, the precise timing, suggests a man with decidedly theatrical instincts, yet everything we learned painted him as methodical, practical, even austere. Where did this sudden flair for the dramatic originate? He swirled his whiskey thoughtfully, watching the firelight catch the amber liquid. I suspect our Mr. Calder had always possessed a Gothic sensibility, carefully suppressed beneath layers of churchwarden respectability. Consider his collection of ecclesiastical fragments, not the mere accumulation of an antiquarian, but the hoarding of a man who found beauty in decay, meaning in broken things. The Saint Felix glass, with its ambiguous figure holding what might be a key or a dagger, appealed to him precisely because it embodied mystery. Parker nodded slowly, his analytical mind finding satisfaction in this explanation. When faced with mortality and the necessity of revealing uncomfortable truths, he chose to embrace the theatrical rather than the merely practical. Death, after all, is the ultimate Gothic moment. The human element, triumphant. Precisely. And Mrs. Rivers' interference, born of maternal desperation, transformed his carefully planned revelation into genuine mystery. The muffled bell, the confused timing, the stolen watch, all created exactly the kind of supernatural atmosphere that would have appealed to Calder's suppressed romantic nature, even as it frustrated his practical intentions. The fire settled with a gentle whisper, sending shadows dancing across the familiar furnishings. In attempting to prevent his Gothic performance, she inadvertently perfected it. Her maternal instincts proved more sophisticated than his theatrical planning, creating the very legal ambiguity that allowed mercy to temper justice. At this moment, the Evening Post arrived with several items of particular relevance. Mr. Finch reported with lawyerly satisfaction that the estate would be settled by consent, Mary and James having agreed to a division so generous that the law itself seemed to capitulate out of gratitude. A letter from Mary, now styling herself Mary Rivers without apology, thanked them for preserving her from a greater deception than poverty, and mentioned that James had taken employment at Norwich to assist with the museum's medieval glass collection. The philosophical resolution. The younger generation's response, Parker observed, shows a wisdom that their elders might have envied. Their willingness to share the inheritance equally, regardless of legal technicalities, suggests they understood intuitively what the law struggles to codify, that love and loyalty create obligations transcending mere blood relationships. Whimsy rose to add another log to the fire, his movements carrying the satisfaction of a man who had restored proper order to a temporarily disordered universe. It's a curious thing, Charles, how a man's final act, intended to be so precise, can be utterly transformed by the very human element he sought to control. Septimus Calder was a man who believed in the absolute authority of facts and the unassailable logic of law. Yet the human heart, as we have discovered, is rarely as amenable to precise calibration as a Tompion clock. The mantelpiece, clock chimed the hour with crystalline clarity, its voice carrying none of the uncertainty that had characterized Saint, Mildred's troubled chronometry. After all, Whimsy continued, raising his glass in a gesture encompassing both conclusion and benediction, if humanity were as logical as a mathematical theorem, where would be the challenge? Where the delicious irony that makes life, and indeed death, so utterly compelling? The final toast. "Come," said Lord Peter, "let us drink to the curious shadow behind the window. May it serve as a reminder that truth, like light, casts its own shadows, and that the most satisfying mysteries are those that resolve themselves into deeper understanding of the human heart. To St. Mildred's, may she stammer only when necessary, and to those who, having once told a lie for love, have the courage to tell the truth for the same reason." The whiskey caught the firelight as they drank, golden as autumn leaves, warm as the satisfaction that comes from seeing justice tempered with mercy and truth revealed in its proper season. Outside, the sounds of London carried on with their accustomed vigor, the reassuring constancy of a city that had learned to accommodate both mystery and revelation with equal equanimity. The fire had settled into a comfortable rhythm, and the shadows no longer held any secrets worth pursuing. In Col de Cham by the sea, the clocks would keep honest time, the bells would ring true, and the Gothic would remain safely confined to the pages of penny dreadfuls where it belonged. The whiskey had achieved that golden equilibrium between warmth and contemplation when Parker consulted his reliable Waltham and observed that the hour approached 11. The fire had settled into its final performance, casting shadows that behaved themselves with proper Anglican discretion, no longer harboring mysteries worth pursuing. "There remains one small satisfaction," said Whimsy, producing a flat package that had arrived with the evening post. The Saint. Felix fragment, photographed under raking light at Norwich. He withdrew the image with ceremonial care. "Observe, Parker, under proper illumination, the ambiguous object in the Saint's hand resolves itself definitively. Not a dagger, as some supposed, but a key. Trust a saint to unlock doors when magistrates would reach for warrants." Parker examined the photograph with professional interest. Rather fitting, given the circumstances. Mr. Calder spent his final weeks attempting to unlock family secrets that had been sealed for 30 years. Precisely. And Mrs. Rivers, in her desperate attempt to relock them, inadvertently created the very confusion that allowed mercy to find its proper keyhole. Whimsy settled deeper into his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose universe had been restored to its correct proportions. "You know, Charles, there's something profoundly satisfying about a mystery that resolves itself into deeper understanding rather than mere explanation." The Gothic's purpose revealed. We began with what appeared to be supernatural manifestation, a shadow behind a window in an empty house, and concluded with revelations of the most earthly sort. Family deceptions, maternal love, and the eternal human struggle between truth and kindness. Yet I find myself oddly grateful for Mr. Calder's Gothic instincts. He paused to contemplate the amber depths of his whiskey, where firelight danced with the patience of flames that had learned their proper behavior. Had he chosen a more conventional departure? A simple letter to his solicitor, perhaps? The truth might have emerged with less drama, but also with less mercy. His theatrical staging, however inadvertently corrupted by Mrs. Rivers' interference, created exactly the legal ambiguity that permitted the younger generation to craft their own solution. The Gothic, it appears, serves a purpose beyond mere entertainment, Parker observed, following this reasoning with the satisfaction of a man whose faith in human nature had been cautiously renewed. It creates space for the inexplicable, room for mercy within the rigid framework of law and logic. Indeed, Mrs. Rivers' frantic nocturnal scramble through churchyards and darkened studies transformed what might have been a mere legal curiosity into something truly worthy of investigation, and ultimately of compassion. Man proposes, God disposes, as the good book reminds us, though in this instance one might substitute mother for God, without undue theological strain. The human heart's victory. The mantelpiece clock chimed the quarter hour with crystalline precision, its voice carrying none of the uncertainty that had characterized the timepieces of their recent adventure. "It always strikes me as profoundly ironic," Whimsy continued, "how often the most meticulously planned deceptions unravel through the very human impulses they seek to suppress. Our Mr. Calder, for all his precision and admirable desire for justice, forgot one crucial element: the unpredictable, illogical, and utterly splendid force of maternal love. The truly interesting crimes," he added, rising to place another log on the fire, "are never about what happened, but why it happened. And the why, my dear fellow, is always a matter of the heart, not the clock." Bunter appeared with that discreet efficiency which suggested the evening's business had been properly concluded. "If I might venture to observe, my lord, the resolution has been unusually tidy." "As tidy as human nature permits," Whimsy replied. "We have established once more that shadows belong before the light, not behind windows. Truth, which has better manners, arrives late perhaps, but with its gloves properly fitted. The literary conclusion." He moved to the piano, where his fingers wandered among the ivories until they found a melody from Purcell, notes that made modest architecture in the air, reminding the room that beauty might be exact without being merciless. "All the world's a stage," he murmured, "and we are but humble critics, offering our occasionally impertinent commentary upon the drama." Parker prepared for departure, hat in hand, but lingering with the satisfaction of a case properly concluded. The younger generation's wisdom in sharing the inheritance equally suggests they understood intuitively what the law struggles to codify: that love and loyalty create obligations transcending mere blood relationships. Quite so. Mrs. Rivers will face the magistrate's mercy. The young people will prosper in their generous wisdom, and even Mr. Strang will presumably learn to trust time as made rather than time as desired. St. Mildred's bell will ring true, having discharged its obligation to both the living and the dead. The final reflection. As Parker took his leave, Whimsy stood at the window where gaslight painted familiar patterns on the familiar street. The curious shadow behind the window had been revealed as nothing more supernatural than candlelight and human desperation. Yet somehow the revelation diminished neither the mystery nor their satisfaction in its solution. "After all," he said to the empty room, taking up his volume of Dawn and finding the famous lines, "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, provided always the clapper be not muffled by over-solicitous relatives." He closed the book with gentle finality. The Gothic shadow has served its purpose admirably, revealing that the most compelling mysteries are often the most thoroughly human. The fire settled with a whisper. The clock marked time with honest precision, and London pursued its ancient conversation with the night. In Coldasham by the sea, the clocks would keep proper time, the bells would speak truth, and the shadows would behave themselves with appropriate discretion. The mystery was solved, the family reconciled, and Lord Peter Whimsy could return to the agreeable business of being merely ornamental until the next shadow decided to misbehave behind the next window. Truth had found its proper voice. Justice had learned to speak with mercy's accent, and the human heart, for all its delightful inconsistencies, had once again proved more robust than the most carefully constructed legal edifice. It was, Whimsy reflected, exactly as it should be in a world where saints carry keys rather than daggers, and where the most Gothic mysteries resolve themselves into the most satisfying human truths.